All right, welcome to Advent of Tessellations 2023. This is a live stream where I'm going to go through what you can expect to fold and what the paper pack options are. And I'm recording this on November 7th, so there may or may not be as much availability as I say by the time that you watch this, but certainly I'll be keeping the paper packs in stock on a continual basis, and so you'll be able to still find them later on. So first, let's walk through Advent of Tessellations. What exactly is that? I'm going to be releasing a video tutorial for a new mini tessellation, and this is a completely new set compared to last year's Advent of Tess. And it's going to be a new tutorial every day from December 1st through 25th. And it's going to start with very beginner-friendly mini tessellations. So this one uses some closed triangle twists under the hood there, and three-way intersections of pleats. And it's going to progressively build harder and harder as we go until we reach a challenging piece at the very end. So we've got another piece. Now this is introducing open triangle twists in addition to the closed triangle that's in the same arrangement as the previous day. And the goal with Advent of Tess is to introduce one new idea, one new skill each day. So going to day 3, that is going to introduce using twists on both sides of the paper and really working on both sides of the paper. And by the way, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. If you're watching the recording, drop them in the comments. I'm happy to answer all the questions. And then we get into using open and closed triangle twists in groups of 4. So that's another thing that we're doing here, is groups of 4 twists. And also using both those twists on opposite sides of the paper. And in the next day, we'll be using both those twists in clusters of 4 with alternating sides within the cluster, as well as between clusters. And then we'll jump into closed hexagon twists, alternating with triangles, open hexagon twists, alternating with triangles, closed hexagon twist, and it looks like it's going to alternate with triangles, but then we can actually stick a different hexagon on the outside. And likewise with this next one, we have the hexagon and then the triangles on the opposite side, and then a different hexagon, which we only get part of because we're using all 16-fold grids. And I'm going to go through towards the end of the video what it means to have a 16-fold triangle grid on a hexagon. And then we introduce rhombus twists. And rhombus twists in a different structure. So, and these might be a little bit out of order. I was pulling them off the shelf and they slid out, but when you go to training.gatheringfolds.com/advent, and that is linked in the description, you can see the full calendar in order. And we have open hexagon with closed triangles and closed rhombi, either on the same side or the opposite side. These are both really cool patterns in backlighting. And then we can get into things like using an open hexagon with open triangles at dense spacing, and use a closed rhombus. We can do that and use an open rhombus. So that's a choice point. even once I've chosen the hexagon and the triangles, I can choose, do I want to have a closed or an open rhombus? Likewise, with many of these other options, there are multiple choices. And you can even take a pattern like this and say, okay, but what if I had the central hexagon be closed instead and have open triangles at the densest spacing available with that and open rhombus twists outside of it? And you get another pattern. You can have your open rhombus with closed triangles around it and closed rhombi at dense spacing. You can even at that point choose to make those rhombuses open. There's a lot of different options here. And then if we return to the hexagon then rhombus framework, so that's a separate rhombus sitting in there, we can have these arrangements and pick which triangle is coming off of it. So here I went with the open triangle. Here I have the open hexagon. So that's a difference with the previous one. And closed rhombi and closed triangles. Then you can do open hexagon and open rhombi. So the difference between these two is whether the rhombus is closed or open. And have another different tessellation. And then what we're aiming for as we get towards the end is trapezoid twists. So I introduce here a different arrangement of hexagons and triangles where the hexagon isn't in the center, instead a group of 6 triangles like we saw in the first few days, in days 4 and 5. So it's the same arrangement of triangles in the center, but we're putting hexagons outside of it. And we end up with the same pattern on the back. So that's kind of trippy that we would be able to see these same patterns on both sides of the paper. And we did see that as well in those days 4 and 5, but with hexagons on both sides. It's kind of crazy. Then if we take each of those hexagons and split it in half, that makes a trapezoid twist. And then we can go and actually that one's going to be the same on both sides as well. And we can go and use those trapezoids around a hexagon with triangles. And we can do that with closed triangles or open triangles. It's all working on the same basis. And last but not least, we can take this idea that we had from earlier on of shapes coming close around an open hexagon and do that with the trapezoid twists as well. So we have the open hexagon, closed triangles on the back, and then the trapezoids. And what makes this one different is we also have some additional folds in the back that we didn't see in, say, this one, because here we have pleats from this trapezoid and this trapezoid running into each other that need to be managed. And so we have the start of a threefold mixed depth open hexagon twist, but we don't need to really have the theory for that when we're folding it at this scale. So that's what you can expect to fold in Advent of Tess. And as you can see, each day we're adding a little bit of difficulty. So if you've never folded Tessellations before, you can expect to get through about the first week, I would say, pretty straightforwardly. After that, it's going to get harder and harder. And if you are already familiar with the basic twists, the close and open, triangle and hexagon, the open rhombus is not what I would consider basic, but I'm still going to go over it and the trapezoid twist in next week's live stream. There's a lot that you can understand just by knowing those twists. And then what I would recommend, if you're struggling in the later patterns, what you can do is take everything and spread it a little bit further apart. So we can use a larger grid. So in this series, we're using all 16-fold grids. But if you take it and use it on a 24-fold grid and spread things further apart, you'll still be able to get those twists in just with more room and less stress. So let's talk a little bit about what materials I recommend for Advent of Tess. So the paper that I use is Skytone, and the size that I have in front of me is 19 inches by 12.5 inches, which is not that easy to get from the manufacturer, Mohawk, but I have a big stash of it and I'm making it available to you, and you can see the paper pack options down below to buy 50 sheets of this paper, and you can buy any number of multiples of 50 sheets, or 75 sheets with some extra tools. So the 75 sheets with extra tools includes these. So I've got a large hexagon that's sized to fit on this sheet of paper. And so you can cut around that, and also a mini hexagon. So this is the size that I folded each of these examples from, and it's the size I'll be folding with in the tutorials. And you can get 2 of these mini hexagons from the leftovers after cutting out a big hexagon on this sheet of paper. And that's another recommendation that I would have if you're having trouble completing each day's tessellation. Try it on a bigger piece of paper. So the exact same thing on a bigger piece of paper will often work better than on a smaller piece of paper. And one of the reasons why this year I'm not offering the 6-inch taunt paper packs is because there were people who got that and then didn't have the option of using a bigger piece of paper when they needed it. So with this size of paper, you always have the option to use a bigger hexagon. And then my favorite tool is the bone folder, mine that I've been using for years. I can tell just by picking it up that it's my bone folder. And so you'll have the opportunity to get one that's exactly like it, but not quite broken in yet. And then a double-sided pencil, because I know not everyone has red and blue pens, and a baggie of clips that can help you prevent yourself from unfolding things while you're folding other parts. So those are the hexagon templates that I typically use for my folding. There are also other hexagon templates available, which I mostly use for framing, but we can have this medium size of hexagon and this small hexagon. The small is the first size where you can get two of the same size out of this sheet. And then if you choose to go for just the paper option, I'm going to show how I would recommend getting a hexagon out of this sheet. Shift these guys over. So I'm going to start by putting a triangle grid onto this rectangle. And that will allow me to get the biggest hexagon possible out of here, or 4 intermediate size hexagons. And so I can, and really if I wanted 2 large-ish hexagons, I would want to do the grid in a different way. But for my purposes right now, since I haven't tested that other option, I will be folding long edge to meet the opposite long edge, getting a fold straight through the middle. Making sure everything is really lined up before I use my bone folder to smooth everything out. So the bone folder is an essential tool for tessellations because it will save your thumb joints. Yeah, trust me on this one, it's been a lifesaver. And now we need to put those 60-degree angles onto the paper. And what I'm going to do is bring the bottom left corner up to that half line. And one thing to note here is that I'm only making these references from one side of my rectangle. So this is not going to happen on all 4 corners. It's just going to happen on these left-hand side corners. And then I'll take the top left corner and bring it in to the center line, making sure to fold through the bottom corner this time of the paper. And this fold should go straight through the intersection of creases that I already have in the paper. And we can take that and use the bone folder there as well. So now I have those 2 corners, and I'm not going to use the other 2 corners for references at all. So from there, I can see that I have a 60-degree angle here and a 120-degree angle here. So I'm going to divide that 120-degree angle in half by bringing the top edge of the paper down along the crease that I just made. And if it's more comfortable for you to fold in a different orientation, that is totally fine. I'm keeping it in this orientation for clarity of instruction. And then opening that one, I have the same situation at the bottom as I had on the top. So I'm going to bring my bottom edge up along this first diagonal crease. And I have an additional reference now that my latest crease needs to line up with the grid intersection that I already have going on. And crease all the way through. And we're going to repeat this process one more time. We have new angles on the top and bottom. And so I'm going to bring the top edge down along this new crease. And one thing to notice is that this new fold is hitting the center line of the paper before it reaches the edge of the paper. And that's good news for us for getting our hexagon. And likewise on the bottom. So if you're working with a different aspect ratio of rectangle, you might have slightly different conditions when you reach the far side, like we are right now. And now I can see the outline of a great big hexagon. And if I wanted to save the remainder of the paper after my hexagon, what I would do is actually another division of grid. So I would go for quarters in that long direction, or across the long direction, however you want to think about it. And then this corner of the big hexagon will actually be right at the edge of the paper. So let me reverse all of the creases of my grid, really, because I haven't reversed any of them yet. I'm going through and doing both the diagonal directions in this pass, and I also want to get that half line. And one of the things that you can do is grid the whole rectangle before cutting out your hexagon. And that would be probably an easy way to get 24 divisions. So if you do an even division and then cut something smaller, that would work out. And so for the next division, I'm going to choose to do the long direction first. It's not gonna really matter which direction I do first, but since it's sitting in front of me in this orientation, I may as well do this one. And I'm going to rotate around, so I'm always folding with the raw edge going away from me. And fold the raw edge into the center instead of folding the center and bringing the center to the raw edge, just for accuracy. And now I'm going to flip my paper and reverse the new creases. And I'm going to pick a diagonal direction, and it doesn't matter which one right now. I'm just rotating, so one of those diagonals is horizontal in front of me. I'm going to pick up one of those folds as a mountain, and this is why we reversed all of our creases, so I can easily pick them up as mountains. And I'm going to bring that mountain to the next crease that's already there and parallel, fold all the way through, and this corner is a grid intersection. So because of the way I set up the grid on this paper, I have grid intersections on the long edges and also this short edge, but not this short edge. I don't have like square root of 3 proportioned paper, so that edge is not having any grid intersections. So with this still folded, I can say this corner is a grid intersection. It's going to need to come to this grid intersection that we have in the middle of the paper. And if I had well, there would be a few fewer references for me to line things up with if I hadn't done the edge parallel creases first, but there's still not that many references to get that crease in place, so that's why I did it while the paper was still folded, so I could see exactly which point to bring that to. And here we have an overlying and underlying crease to a line, and just generally looking for references. But again, when we get to this edge, we cannot use the edge of the paper as a reference. Then I'm going to rotate around and bring the crease closest to the corner into the next crease. Fold all the way through. And this time I have a little flap sticking out past the corner, but it's going to be less accurate for me to bring it up now. And what we're going to see in a moment is that it doesn't actually impact any of the hexagons that we want to cut out. So I'm going to leave that be, but if you're gridding the whole rectangle, you're eventually going to want that crease. And before I do the next direction of diagonals, I'm going to reverse those 3 new creases. One thing to pay attention to is I'm always folding valleys on the same side of the paper. So there's a side of the paper where the paper is more scarred, where I have the mountains, and then a side that is smoother, where I have the valleys. And it's one of those distinctions that is easier to pick up on a paper like Skytone compared to, say, Kami. Although with Kami you can have a colored side and a non-colored side. With Taunt, you're depending on the feel and look of the paper, just like with Skytone, because it's the same color on both sides. And one thing you might notice when you've been gridding a long time is you can start gridding automatically without your brain keeping up, like I just did there. And yeah, Aderic, I'm glad you're enjoying the tips. This is very much geared towards getting people into their first grid of this type. So now we do actually have a reference crease if we wanted to get that little bit in the corner, bringing the edge that is part of the long edge to the existing crease. That will allow us to make our little fold, and we can continue across grabbing the next section. So one thing that I want to emphasize here is it doesn't really matter which direction you start, like which side of the paper you start folding a particular grid direction from. You're going to end up in the same place. And now we're back in the corner that is a grid intersection. And bringing that up, since we already did the previous round of diagonals, I have a diagonal crease through here that I can use as a reference. I'm also using the grid intersection where it lines up with the corner, and this overlying and underlying crease, and the fact that I'm going to fold to a grid intersection at the end of the crease, which again is true on this side of the paper where we have folds going straight to the corners, but is not true on the other side of the paper. So now I can reverse all of my new creases. And while we're over in this non-grid intersection edge, I can get that little flap that was left behind on the first set of diagonal creases in this division of the grid, because now I have the good reference for it, and reverse it. But again, that's mostly for completeness of how we're putting the triangle grid onto the broader paper, and it's not something that will stop us from cutting out the hexagons that we want. So from here, one of the things to notice is if we wanted to cut out a big hexagon and leave as large a chunk of paper after as possible, we would want to be cutting on these lines that I'm marking in red, or at least marking the corners. And we have other options as well. So for a smaller hexagon that we can get 4 of on this paper, we would want to first cut across the entire center line. And I'm emphasizing that you want to cut that first, because if you don't, you'll end up cutting into your next hexagon when you're cutting out the neighboring one. And the next hexagons, and notice how I'm using the fold to align where my pen is going. I do exactly the same thing when I'm cutting. So I bring up my fold, and then with my quilting ruler or whatever other straight edge I have handy, and you want one that's big enough to cover the entire line, but for alignment demonstration this works well. You can have that paper, that crease folded at a 90-degree angle, at a right angle, and you want to get the whatever straight edge you're using snug in there, hold it down, let the fold come down, and then cut along that line. So that's one reason why having folds is great for cutting. What I usually do with the hexagon templates is just use the hexagon template as the cutting guide without any folds on the paper at all, like I was mentioning earlier. But if you do not have the hexagon templates, then folds are a really great way and a more accurate way of getting your cuts than, for example, using the 60-degree measurement on a quilting ruler. So now you can see I can get 2 hexagons from each half of the rectangle. And these hexagons already have the central grid lines, which is really convenient because there's actually 2 ways to put the central grid lines onto hexagons by dividing in half. This is what I would call the aligned way, where the grid lines are aligned with the edges of the hexagon. There's also a perpendicular way, or a diagonal grid, where you do the perpendiculars to the edges. So for Advent of Tess, we're doing aligned 16-fold triangle grids on hexagons. And I'm going to grab a different hexagon to show you some of the tips for folding that. And again, don't hesitate to ask questions if you have them. So the first thing that I'm going to do if I have a completely blank hexagon is fold the central grid axes. So like we saw with the rectangle earlier, you can put a triangle grid on whatever shape you have, whether it's a square, a triangle, a hexagon, a rectangle. You can put a triangle grid on it. And there's freedom in how exactly you choose to do so. What I'm going to do is hold the hexagon so that I have two edges horizontal in front of me, and I'm going to bring the bottom edge up to the top edge. And when I'm gridding for myself, I usually also go ahead and fold then the bottom edge into the center, doing a cupboard, cabinet, bookcase, whatever you want to call that kind of fold. And then I'll rotate halfway around so I can bring the raw edge into the center, because we can get this far without needing to cross any existing creases or pick up anything as a mountain. And then I'll flip the paper over and reverse those three creases, come back to my valley side, rotate the paper so I have a new set of parallel edges horizontal relative to me, and bring the bottom edge up to the top. And then bottom edge into the center. Rotate halfway around and bring the new bottom edge into the center again. And now reversing the creases, coming back to the valley side, rotating to the third direction, bring the bottom edge up to the top, bottom edge into the center, rotate halfway around, bring the new bottom edge into the center, and flip over and reverse my new creases. Okay, so far so good. Now I'm going to take my bottom edge, and it really doesn't matter which of the three I'm using. I'm just staying in the same orientation because it minimizes movements. And I'm going to take the bottom edge in to that first parallel grid line. And then I'm going to open and pick up that next grid line as a mountain, bringing it to the center line. And open, pick up that next grid line as a mountain, bring it to the next line, so in each step we're dividing the space between existing grid lines in half, and instead of picking up the next one as a mountain and bringing it to the raw edge, I'm going to rotate halfway around and bring the raw edge up to that next mountain. And then I'm going to reverse just the new creases and come back to my valley fold side before rotating and repeating those steps exactly. So I'm bringing my bottom edge to the first grid line that's parallel to it, fold, open, pick up that next grid line, bring it to the one after. Open, pick up that next grid line, bring it to the grid line after. And you can see how you would be able to repeat these steps as many times as you want. And rotate and bring the raw edge up to the next grid line. And flip over and reverse. So there's a question in the chat, would this method be preferable compared to having all the folds be valley folds on one side? So what I'm doing is I'm folding all the valleys from one side, and then I'm making sure to reverse the folds so that they can act as mountains or valleys. And then I'm coming back, and on the same side that I folded everything as valleys before, I'm folding them as valleys again. So there's two sides of the paper, the side that I'm folding the grid on, and then the side that I'm reversing the creases on. So effectively, I am putting all my valleys on the same side. I'm just making the creases more flexible, so I can choose to pick them up as mountains later. So here we've got all the valleys on the same side, and I'm reversing the creases that I just added, and then returning to the valley fold side for the next set of divisions. And so now I'm going to do exactly, reversing them neutralizes them, so now I can pick them up as mountains when I need to. So now back on the valley side of the paper, I'm going to bring my raw edge to the next grid division, and now I'm starting to notice, so this is the final set of divisions to get to 16. We did 4 divisions in the first round, another division of 2 got us to 8, and now we're doing another division of 2 to get to 16. And bringing the raw edge to the next grid line, this is a very skinny, long strip of paper. And you can notice it's starting to want to wiggle. So what can we do to prevent that? What I'm going to do is, instead of dividing one section in half, I can divide 3 sections in half. So I'm going to bring the raw edge up to the 1, 2, 3, third grid line. And then I want to have this be a sliding window of 3 spacings. So you might have seen other places to just keep bringing the raw edge 2 spaces further up and 2 spaces further up, but that's placing the references for the fold further and further from the fold. So especially with grids, and particularly if you have any cause to think that your hexagon is not perfect, you want to keep those references close to the fold. But having them half a grid spacing on either side is problematic because of the wiggling. So we're going to fold back onto the next old fold, bring it up so we still have our latest fold folded. We folded back 1 old division, aka 2 new divisions, and we're going to bring that mountain 2 spacings up. And fold through. So this is a technique that I call the 3 halves method. So then I'm going to come back, grab that grid line as a mountain and bring it 2 old spacings up and fold through, fold back and up, and back and up. And just like when we were dividing spacings directly in half, I don't want to bring the folded edge to the raw edge. What I want to do instead is rotate around and bring the raw edge to the fold without it being folded to the crease, I suppose. And then on the very edge, we'll have to bring the raw edge just 1 spacing up for that final division. And we'll reverse all of the new creases, which is every other one. So one of the things I like to think about as I'm gridding is what percentage of the grid is done. And when you start the final division of 2, half of your grid is done, which can be a little bit discouraging sometimes, but then you get to do interesting math that's like, okay, half, and then 1/3 of a half is a 1/6, a half and a 1/6 together gets you 2/3. So when you've done the first direction of divisions after in the final round of divisions, you are now 2/3 done. But that's my nerd brain going and amusing itself. And so for the next 2 directions, we're going to do exactly the same thing that we did before. I was talking over it for this round, but I'll talk through it again with the next direction. And the video is recorded, so you can go back and see everything and even play it back in a slower speed if you want. And so second round of divisions. So the gridding doesn't have to be super slow. With this size of grid, I can reliably finish it in about 7 minutes if I'm not talking through it. And it's a grid that I've done, probably hundreds of times. So I can do it while watching a video or listening to a podcast or talking on the phone to my parents. There's all kinds of options. So that first division had to be raw edge to first grid line. And then we're going to start the sliding window of 3 spacings. So this first window is bottom edge to third grid line. And then we'll fold back to the tiny division before the fold we just made and bring that mountain now 2 hops up. And then fold back. So there's 1 tiny division of pleat there, or I should say 1 tiny division between the mountain and the valley. We'll get into what a pleat is in the first tutorial. And then bring the mountain 2 hops up. And fold back and bring the mountain 2 hops up. And fold back and bring the mountain 2 hops up. and fold back. And if we were to go 2 hops up, we'd hit the raw edge. So we're going to rotate around, unfold, and bring the raw edge up to the 3rd old division. And this is the part where it's easiest to make a mistake, because it doesn't look like what you've had before. You need to pass this valley to get to the 3rd mountain, or rather mountain with respect to the crease that had been reversed. And then our final crease will be right there in that edge division. So one other thing that you want to take care of when you think that you're finishing a grid is to make sure that you have all of your directions at the same number of divisions. So the easiest way to do that is to hold your paper up to a light source, and it will become clear pretty quickly whether you have all your divisions or not. So these purposes, I'll use my phone light, and when you have your grid all the way done, you'll have these itty bitty triangles that are all the same size. So when you have one division that's ahead of the other 2, you will have trapezoids and triangles. When you have one division left behind, you will have stripes of rhombuses that are lining up, and it'll be like stripes of rhombuses and stripes of triangles. But if you have all itty bitty triangles, then you are done. So that is the grid for Advent of Tess. It's the same grid for all 25 of the tutorials, and it's the same grid as last year's round as well. So that's going to be all for today, unless there's some last minute questions. And happy folding, everyone. And I'll see you for the tutorials on December 1st. And also, if you're watching in live time, next week I'll go over how to fold each of the 7 twists that we'll be seeing inside of Advent of Tess, so you can practice them in advance. So happy folding.